General of the BBC, who found himself immolated in the fallout of an attack on Alistair Campbell's dodgy dossier. But we saw that the approach of the media at the time was very much in the hands of the media owners who control our press. And during the Leveson inquiry, Rupert Murdoch maintained that he doesn't dictate an editorial line, he has no involvement whatsoever, he doesn't influence what his editors put in the pages of the newspaper titles. But if that's the case, how and why at that time did all but one of his 175 newspapers then have the same pro-war line on a rack in 2003? And it wasn't just the national newspaper owners at that time. Sir Ray Tyndall, who owns about 15% of Britain's local newspapers, issued a decree in all of his 120 plus titles in which he said at the time, nothing will appear which will attack the decision to conduct the war, and added that he'd withhold material and photographs that were critical of the war without a hint of irony, adding, this decision has been made democratically by me. And for reporters at the battle's front line, for photographers who risk their lives as the snipers' bullets rattle against the wall beside them, the narrative of what's happened isn't decided by them. It's very much decided in the plush corporate head offices of whichever media owner they work for, a million miles from the reality of what war brings. But the public need to know and to make decisions based on fact, and that's more so than ever when we're facing conflict. We need to know, as members of the public, the plight of those who suffer at the hands of states we support, that we finance, that we arm. We need to know about the links between foreign policy and terrorism, so absurdly often denied by governments, and about the attempts to criminalise and silence dissent or to scapegoat communities at home. And that's why the NUJ believes the setup that we currently have, the form of media ownership that we have in this country, must be challenged. We want to have limits on news market share. We want to see the maximum market share set at 25% for national news. We want regional news on all platforms, radio, TV, newspapers online, where there's a market share that reaches or is able or liable to reach 15%, to be subject to a proper public interest test and to have a public consultation about the rights and the wrongs of this. We think these things are absolutely critical to the public's right to know, and that's why we're calling for regulation. That's not state regulation, that's not straight state control of the press. We are absolutely fervently opposed to any form of limitation to press freedom in this country as the National Union of Journalists. But we have been calling throughout our evidence at the Leveson inquiry for an independent system of regulation, not the self-regulation on the boss's terms that we've had for years and that has failed and performed so woefully. We want an independent regulator that not only is independent of government, but is independent of the industry. And within that independent regulation system, we believe it shouldn't just be the voices of the media owners that are heard, it should be the voices of the journalists, ordinary working journalists, as well as members of the public. And we think that's absolutely vital. And at the Leveson inquiry, we've been pushing for a conscience clause so that when journalists do stand up on a principle of journalistic integrity and ethics, they can have the protection in law of not being sacked, because the reality of any single journalist who works for a newspaper at the moment, or any media outlet, if they don't do something that their editor tells them to do, they can be sacked, summarily dismissed. They don't have that contractual protection, and it's vital that that's tackled. It's no surprise that in the last couple of weeks, the NUJ has faced huge criticism from parts of the press who are desperately trying to maintain the status quo in the run-up to Lord Leveson's report at the end of this month. They have accused the NUJ of trying to turn the UK into Zimbabwe or into Iran. They've accused us of wanting state repression of the media. All of these things are ridiculous assertions that are based on a sustained campaign from the status quo and the vested interests within the industry who are turning their fire on anybody who wants to challenge their power. I just want to make it perfectly clear that the NUJ does not support state control of the media. What we're trying to have is a media that's genuinely accountable to all of you, to all of our communities who are very often demonised, and to journalism, and to stand up for quality journalism. Thank you. That's obviously absolutely not the case, and we've got brilliant people working across all of the kind of mainstream outlets and many members of the NUJ as well. It's unfortunately not the case that we don't have strong union organisation in many of those workplaces, unlike the Financial Times chapel or unlike the Guardian, where we've got excellent, very organised, very dynamic chapels. The reality, and it's no surprise that some of the worst excesses in the press have been in places where not only are there no NUJ, no chapels or organisation, but they're in workplaces and companies where the companies won't even let the NUJ have a foot in the door. They won't even let any of our officials come in and represent individual members. And we do have a situation in the UK where we have some of the biggest media groups, the most outrageously anti-trade union of any companies here. You know, where I'm talking about Associated Newspapers, publish the Mail, or News International, publish the Sun, and others, the Times. And that's one of the issues we've been trying to address at the Leveson inquiry, which is to say that actually when you're looking at this whole picture of the state of our press and of the abuses that have taken place, and hacking on an industrialised scale, not for reasons of the public interest, which I would absolutely defend. But when you look at the reality of that, you look at those workplaces and you've got people who work there who are completely disempowered. They can't come together collectively to challenge their management, which is one of levels of hierarchy. And,
excuse me, you only
organisation. I'll give you a chance in a minute.
The only organisation you mentioned there was Associated Newspapers. That is, but no hacking has been found in Associated Newspapers. You mustn't. Well, you shouldn't have mentioned Associated in that context because there's been no hacking found. Yeah.
I didn't. I mentioned News International before I mentioned hacking. And the reality is that in those places, if you're a journalist, you can't come together with your colleagues and challenge anything. When I was at the Express, we did that through our chapel and it was bloody difficult. At that time, we complained as a chapel to the PCC against the lies that were being peddled against asylum seekers and against gypsies in our newspapers every single day. And the PCC, which is the self-regulatory form on the boss's terms that I mentioned earlier, wrote back to a letter to us. It was Sir Christopher Mayer at that time, the chairman, that we wrote to as a chapel, complaining about the pressure that our individual journalists were coming under, the fact that people were on the brink of quitting because they were being put under intolerable pressure to write racist lies. And the response back was that that they didn't think that there was any problem in the Express. They didn't believe that journalists were coming under pressure. How they knew that, I do not know, because they didn't come and ask any individual journalist. Perhaps they got that from our own editor at the time, who sat with him on the same committee that was considering our complaint. And that's the problem with the system that we have at the moment. It's unrepresentative, and it protects the interests of the vested interests and the owners and the editors who do not represent the reality of life as a working journalist. And one of the other things we raised at Leveson was about the endemic bullying within the industry. It's not just in the press, it's in other parts of the industry as well. But we took anonymised testimony to the Leveson inquiry. The industry, particularly Associated Newspapers, they took Leveson to judicial review. They fought very hard to prevent the union from putting forward this testimony because they didn't want it to be heard. One of the reasons that they argued about in court was saying that members of the public couldn't differentiate between an anonymised source or somebody who was going off the record, which is rich when in the pages of every single newspaper every day you will have references to anonymous sources. But we fought that and we won, and we were able to describe the reality of life for some journalists. And one of those that we did was a journalist who had come under intolerable pressure, who did end up quitting because they couldn't cope anymore. And it was about the lies that they were being forced to write about Muslims, demonising Islam every single day. And when this person had complained about it to their boss and had really said they weren't prepared to have their bylines on, the reaction of that person's boss was to make this person do those stories every single day as kind of punishment duties, to the point in which the individual wasn't able to cope and just resigned from a job. We don't want that. We think it's much better to try and change the reality of working life from within, and I think that's what trade unions are about. And it's why it's really important that we should have collective bargaining rights in these workplaces, because journalists as trade unions don't just stand up for their terms and conditions and their wages and payments, but they also defend ethical journalism and journalistic integrity. And if they have the ability to do that as part of their union, it's a damn sight better than the situation we currently have at the moment.
Right, can we take a couple more?